Welcome to Grand Rounds. Our speaker today is Dr. Elizabeth Gillespie. The topic is climate change and health, clinical pearls for geriatricians. A couple of announcements. Our next Grand Rounds is May 5th. It's a joint Grand Rounds, and the topic is going to be reflections from our fellows. Our next journal club is May 12th. Let's see here. Oh, it looks like this may have been canceled. So I will check back in with you all about that. Other announcements: following today's rounds, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording of today's presentation and a copy of the PowerPoint. Also included in the email will be a link to an online evaluation. Please submit questions for this Grand Rounds in the chat or Q&A boxes at any time. I'd like to introduce Dr. Gillespie, who's a hospitalist at Denver Health and an assistant professor in the School of Medicine at the University of Colorado Anschutz. She is a master's candidate in epidemiology at the Colorado School of Public Health. Dr. Gillespie's primary professional interest is in clinical research and education surrounding the climate and health nexus, with a particular focus on understanding the ideal role for local health systems in climate change mitigation and adaptation. She held a leadership position representing the Society of General Internal Medicine on the steering committee for the Medical Consortium on Climate Change and Health, and in 2019 completed a 2-year clinical research fellowship focused on climate change and health through the Adult and Child Consortium for Health Outcomes Research and Delivery Science, the University of Colorado School of Medicine. Dr. Gillespie continues to work in this area, has continued to work in this area through July 2022 as a guest researcher with the CDC's Climate and Health Team, a position made possible through her 2021-2022 fellowship with CU's Climate and Health Science Policy. Over the last 3 years, Dr. Gillespie has also helped direct the medical school's elective on climate and health. I'd like to give a big warm welcome to Dr. Gillespie. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Devin. It's great to be here with you guys and to share this topic. I'll just go ahead and share my screen. All right. So happy Earth Week, everyone. Thanks for joining me. I'm hoping to share a few clinical pearls that you're able to bring to your practice on climate change and health. Sorry. All right, so I have no disclaimers. These learning objectives were included in an attachment with an invitation to the talk. So I won't go over them in detail, but we can see at the bottom of the screen the mission of the American Geriatric Society: to improve the health, independence, and quality of life of older people. Climate change is creating a number of conditions that threaten human health. Health, independence, and quality of life of our patients will depend partially on how well they're able to adapt to these conditions. So we'll talk about specific ways healthcare providers can help. So first, some background on the science. So this is a graph of global temperatures and carbon dioxide concentrations over time, going back to the time of the Industrial Revolution, when humans began burning coal on a massive scale. So we see CO2 steadily increasing from around 290 parts per million up to the present time. And the recent rise has been exponential. We're now at 420 parts per million. The trends in CO2 mirror those in average global temperatures. So the Earth is on average 2.1 degrees Fahrenheit or 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer than it was in pre-industrial times, with most of the warming occurring most recently. And overall, the Earth is 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit or about 1 degree Celsius warmer than the 20th century average. So most of that warming has happened just recently. So this isn't just correlation, and climate scientists have shown that CO2 and other greenhouse gases are driving what we call climate change, which is represented in the middle circle here of rising CO2 levels, rising temperatures, more extreme weather, and rising sea levels. And these all have downstream effects on what we call environmental hazards that we see on the outer circle. And the outermost part of the graphic, and in the outermost part of the graphic, we see how the hazards threaten every aspect of human health. And this is why a recent article in The Lancet called climate change the biggest public health threat of the 21st century. So this morning, we're not going to focus on all of these health threats, but we're going to focus on the health effects of two main environmental hazards, which are heat and poor air quality, and how older patients can build more resilience to these hazards with your help. So starting with heat. So these, we're going to go over a few historical examples, but older patients are especially susceptible to heat-related illness. And this has been studied in the context of a number of historical heat waves. So during the infamous Chicago heat wave, which many of you will probably remember in the news in 1995, hospital admissions occurred in excess of 1,000 and deaths in excess of 700 above historic July averages. And if you haven't seen this book, Heat Wave by Eric Kleinenberg, it's a really good read, and it's a unique look, a sociologic evaluation of the risk factors of dying in the heat wave. And what he found was that those at highest risk of death were those who were elderly, who were living alone, who were African American, and in neighborhoods with concentrated poverty, violent crime, and poor overall social infrastructure. And then going on to another example from more recent times, elderly people also died in greater numbers during the Pacific Northwest heat wave. Officials in Multnomah County in Oregon confirmed that there were 54 cases of hyperthermia. And of these people, most of them were elderly. The average age was 70. Most were white, male, living alone without air conditioning, which was not a surprise in the Pacific Northwest. And usually you shouldn't need it. And then going over other historic examples, so similar age trends we're seeing internationally. And there was a couple of studies done, particularly among elderly individuals. There was a 28% average increase in deaths among people older than 75 over 23 years of heat periods studied in Australia. And then in Moscow, similar trends. In European heat wave, similar trends. So I think we can all identify with this famous quote from Mother Teresa, which I come back to a lot. If I look at the masses, I'll never act. And if I look at one, I will. And this is why physicians think like case examples. So you've probably seen this patient before in clinic. So Mrs. M is an 80-year-old woman with chronic hypoxic respiratory failure from COPD. She's on 2 liters. She has some allergies and she has well-controlled hypertension and depression. And she's just coming to clinic around this time of year for her annual visit. And she really has no complaints. For social history, she drinks a glass of wine a day, no tobacco. She lives alone and she's independent with her ADLs. And she has a few complaints on review of systems, but really overall negative. And she's on a number of medications that control her medical conditions. So she's on Advair, tiotropium, albuterol, hydrochlorothiazide, citalopram, and loratadine. So we'll come back to her in a little bit, but how can we help protect her from adverse health outcomes related to heat? So I'll offer this framework as we think about some answers to this question. Here we have heat exposure on the left. And some of these aspects people can control, like how much time they spend outside when it's hot, or whether or not they're using air conditioning. And then other factors are at play on the right. A number of vulnerability factors, that some of which we can modify. We can't turn back the clock on age, but there are some baseline health conditions like COPD and how well these are controlled. And then whether people are using certain medications, whether they live in the city or the suburbs, because we know that there's an effect called the urban heat island, where city temperatures, the differential between the city and urban areas can be upwards of 10 degrees all throughout the day and even into the night. And then also depends on other neighborhood factors that we discussed a little earlier. So heat exposure is getting harder to avoid. And this graph comes from Climate Central that has a lot of city-specific and state-specific data on climate variables. And it's a little bit outdated now because we've seen that recent summers have had days over 100. But whether we follow, looking to the future, whether we follow current emission trends or make moderate emission cuts, Denver will continue to see more and more days that reach above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, at least 20 by 2050. So I wanted to show some more local statistics, and this slide comes from some research I'm doing looking at some trends in acute care utilization among Denver Health patients during heat periods. And we look back over 5 years to look at these utilization trends just during the hotter periods of summertime months. And our study uses utilization as a surrogate for heat-related health outcomes because providers in general are not so great at documenting whether or not health outcomes are related to heat. And so the graph plots certain variables against their incident rate ratios of healthcare utilization during heat periods versus non-heat periods. So whether or not you use healthcare more frequently during these heat periods versus non over the summer. And so just focusing on the variable of age at the left side of the graph, 19 to 64-year-olds and seniors have significant more heat sensitive utilization compared with youth. And this really isn't a surprise, but I just wanted to show you some of the things that are being worked on locally. I really like this graphic because it's a really good example of the physiology of thermoregulatory response. So the normal response to heat stress is depicted here in the peach colored boxes with the potential outcomes in green or red, and we want to stay in the green. So when the body faces a heat stress, we have three main reactions that are healthy reactions. So we can seek the cold or seek a cooler area. And then second, blood goes out to the periphery and cutaneous vasodilatation. More blood gets exposed to a larger surface area, the same way you might cool off some hot soup by pouring it into a shallow bowl. And this works by two mechanisms. So first, the cardiac output increases to get more blood out to the periphery. And next, you get peripheral vasodilatation, and this decreases venous return. We'll come back to why that's important in a little bit. But the third mechanism is evaporation. And that's where you start blowing on that bowl of soup to help cool it off. So for everything to work as planned, you first need to be able to sense when it's hot. And that signal needs to get to your brain so that your brain can send instructions to the periphery to, for example, start dilating those peripheral vessels. And that signal is disrupted in people who are on certain centrally acting medications, or for poorly controlled diabetics who have damaged peripheral and central receptors. So after the signal gets processed, peripheral vasodilatation works best when you have a strong heart and a full tank. But if you're starting out with an ejection fraction of say 30%, or if you're older and have a lower maximum heart rate, the higher temperatures are really going to stress the system, and you can get tipped off the Starling curve into decompensated heart failure as you get overheated. So the same endpoint can happen if you're on vasodilators like nitrates, or if your furosemide is working too well. And then if peripheral resistance is too low, you can suffer symptoms of heat syncope when you fail to perfuse your brain. And then for moving on to evaporative cooling, for everything to work well there, your sweat glands need to be in top form. And this also isn't true for poorly controlled diabetics who tend to have decreased sweat gland density. And a number of drugs that we commonly prescribe also reduce the sweat response, like anticholinergics, anxiolytics, antihistamines, and antipsychotics. And then if you're unable to sweat, of course, you can fall behind and get hyperthermic and eventually suffer heat stroke. And then when evaporative cooling is working well and you've sweat a lot, you can become dehydrated, you can experience hyponatremia and other electrolyte imbalance. And then one more interesting point that's worth mentioning is that cooling only really works when temperature differentials are in the body's favor. So the skin surface has to be warmer than the temperature outside, or else the heat won't transfer. And so if the temperature outside is hotter, or if the body temperature is warmer, like in people who are on Ritalin or who are taking cocaine, that places undue stress on the system because you already have that higher set point. So why does normal aging, what is it about normal aging that predisposes the body to heat stress or makes it more susceptible to heat stress? There are a few roadblocks. So thinking first about the cutaneous vasodilatation, we know that because of decreased beta-adrenergic responsiveness, the maximum heart rate decreases with age, that 220 minus age, and therefore so does maximum cardiac output. So this is depicted in this diagram here, which comes from a study done by Dr. Kenny. So you have young, healthy individuals on the left and older healthy individuals on the right. And young, healthy individuals were able under heat stress to increase their cardiac output by 4,800 milliliters per minute, whereas healthy older individuals were only able to increase by an average of 2,000 milliliters per minute. And there's also increased heart strain as healthy older individuals work to maintain that stroke volume in heat stress. And that leads to increased risk of MI in the setting of heat stress. And then part of the circulatory redistribution also depends on how well blood is being sent to the periphery. So from the splanchnic and renal circulation. And this also is mobilized more easily in younger individuals. You know, in this study, it was, they were able to send 1,000 milliliters per minute, whereas the older individuals were able to send 700 milliliters per minute. So for all of these reasons, blood flow is impaired to the skin, making cutaneous vasodilatation harder. So then evaporative cooling also becomes less efficient with normal aging. So we talked about needing a full tank, and if we don't, we can become dehydrated and experience heat exhaustion. And older individuals are more prone to dehydration, you know, because there's lower overall total body water. And this is important because dehydration severity depends on the relative loss of water rather than on the absolute loss of total body water. So you have less to begin with, you can get into trouble more quickly. And there also might be decreased awareness of the need to drink because of reduced thirst. And then the capacity to conserve salt and water in the kidneys is also reduced. And then thinking about just how evaporation is actually working, we have, similar to poorly controlled diabetics, as we age, we get different distribution in our sweat glands and by region. And the greatest reductions happen in the abdomen and lesser reductions in the thigh, low back, and arms. So overall reduction. And it's also aging is also associated with decreased output per sweat gland. So a number of factors increasing the risk for heat stress with healthy, normal aging. So then when you add a number of chronic medical conditions, dysregulated heat response becomes even more likely. So this is kind of a simplified diagram, but a number of organ systems we'll go through just to show some examples. So for kidney disease, people with kidney disease are more prone to electrolyte imbalance and might be more susceptible to heat cramps. And then there's also in ESRD more prevalence of systolic and diastolic heart failure. So making it harder for them to keep up with increased cardiac demands when it gets hot. And then those with, moving on to cardiovascular disease, those with ischemic heart disease may not pass their stress test when there's that increased stress on the heart to maintain stroke volume. And then we talked about the risks of poorly controlled diabetics. Obesity, you know, very prevalent in our society. Adipose tissue doesn't conduct heat as well. And so people who are overweight and obese are more likely to overheat. And then lung disease is a big one. You know, people with lung disease are not just susceptible to air pollution. You have that increased cardiac output or the increased metabolic demand of peripheral vasodilatation. And that requires increased respiratory rate, and which can trigger exacerbation of COPD or asthma in susceptible individuals. And then there's a long list of medications that dysregulate the response to heat that I'll show you a list of in a second. So I just wanted to focus a little bit more on diabetes because of its prevalence. You know, 10% of the population, 20% of those who were 65 and older. And there's this higher risk of dying on hot days. So there was this one study done in a single county in 2005 that's often cited in the literature of giving this 17% increased risk of dying. A number of reasons for impaired cooling because of the decreased vasodilatation and decreased evaporative sweating. However, this can be overcome with physical fitness. And then another thing to just keep in mind that when it gets hot, there's some considerations around insulin storage. The max safe range of insulin is 93 to 95, you know, which should be considered when indoor temperatures get hotter, but then also insulin pumps are something that people use. And if they're outside, that is exposed to the ambient temperature, and that insulin can become ineffective in a shorter period of time. So this is that list, and it's not exhaustive, and it doesn't explain exactly why all of these things predispose you to heat illness, but it's probably fair to say that a number of our patients are on more than a couple of these classes of medication. So Mrs. M was taking a few for her hydrochlorothiazide. We already know that people on hydrochlorothiazide are more prone to hyponatremia, so already prone to the electrolyte imbalances that you can experience with evaporative cooling. She was also on loratadine. Antihistamines, including loratadine, inhibit reduce sweating, and other ones like Benadryl can reduce systolic blood pressure. And then her citalopram is an antidepressant that can reduce sweating, cognition, and central thermoregulation. So, maybe make her less likely to seek a cooler environment when it gets hot. I mentioned a couple of these other ones. If you're interested and have time, these review articles by these two authors are very informative as to the mechanisms of these medications and the heat and dysregulated response to heat. So what can we do to prevent heat illness? So education is the main thing. Educate them about heat illness symptoms, which in elderly patients, symptoms of dehydration can be reduced attention span, dry mucous membranes, lower blood pressure, delirium, which is not very specific, but kind of a clue that something's going on. And then other things that are good, just good tips. So to wear loose-fitting clothing, stay hydrated, avoid alcohol. And then in people that don't have that awareness to drink when they're thirsty, maybe can't get to the water, get to the fluid, it's important to tell caregivers that they should be monitoring fluid balance in people that need that. And then sunburn is important because sunburned skin doesn't dissipate heat as well, and it's harder to cool off. And then for all the reasons that we talked about in the last slide, just think about, geriatricians are so good about minimizing the number of medications people are on, but now there's another reason with heat illness. Consider their susceptibility to heat. And then other things to consider in social history and environmental history that we're not always good at taking. Do they have access to air conditioning? Do they live on the top floor of their house or their apartment where the rooms tend to get hotter at night? And then a patient pointed this out to me that, her annual visit was in the winter. They don't necessarily have these discussions about heat safety on the top of their minds. And so it may not come up if the annual visit is, in the winter time. So something to keep in mind if, you're only seeing otherwise healthy patients once a year. And then I just found this, it's a fact sheet that you may find helpful. You can print out for your clinic. And this is from the Health and Aging Foundation from the American Geriatric Society. It goes over a number of the points on the last slide. So moving on to the next environmental hazard that's associated with climate change. So air has been described as an equalizing resource that everyone is exposed to throughout their entire lives. At the same time, more than 4 in 10 Americans live in places with unhealthy levels of pollution. So first, to talk about ozone. It's made via a photochemical reaction between VOx and NOx, so volatile organic compounds, and nitrous oxides, as well as heat and sunlight, which is why we see these signs to refuel in the evening or in the morning when these chemical reactions are less likely to be occurring when it's cooler. And so significant sources of NOx are chemical plants, gasoline pumps. VOx you find in power plants, industrial furnaces, and boilers, and auto traffic. And so ozone is toxic, we all know, and there's really no safe level. So mortality risks and benefits have been quantified according to ozone concentrations. And this statistic comes from an article in The Lancet that was looking at data from the Global Burden of Disease study of 2015, where they estimated this 0.26% excess mortality increase per 5 parts per billion increase in daily 1 hour max ozone, which is one of the factors studied by one of the measures tracked by the EPA. And tighter ozone standards should reduce premature deaths. So the second predictive statistic here comes from the EPA rulemaking in 2015, when the 75 parts per billion standard of 2008 was tightened by 5. So they said that for areas over a certain concentration, that have a certain concentration of ozone, this revised standard of 70 is estimated to reduce ozone-associated premature death by 50 to 70%. And then this map is from the 2017 study in The Lancet that shows the proportion of deaths attributed to ozone. And you can notice the higher proportion of deaths that are occurring in countries with heavy industry. The US had some of the highest proportional deaths at more than 2.6 per 100,000 back in 2015. So this is another diagram for, wanted to include some physiology here, describing just the pathophysiology of ozone-related respiratory illness. So ozone is this tiny molecule that gets into the lungs and just lodges deep down in the bronchioles, and it causes inflammation through oxidative stress. There's this neural reflex activation that initiates inflammation. And then it can cause some long-term consequences. So it can alter the barrier of the lung, raising the susceptibility to infection. It can cause sensitization of bronchial smooth muscles, so predisposing people or triggering exacerbations of COPD and asthma. And it can cause airway remodeling over time. And these effects are summarized here. The shorter term effects are more proven, and longer term exposures are kind of harder to attribute to ozone just because of the other contributing factors in other parts of the air. But it has been linked to development of asthma and development of COPD. And I already talked about it's causing premature deaths and hospital admissions and ER visits. So this is bad news for us and our patients. So out of 200, looking on the right, out of 226 metro areas that were categorized by the American Lung Association, Denver Aurora ranks 8th most polluted, and Fort Collins isn't too far behind. So the Front Range is notorious for failing to meet EPA standards. The light and dark blue areas on this map failed to meet EPA standards in 2016 when this map was made, but there are similar maps that I haven't updated for today. But those maps feed into the reason for this headline that came out last week from CPR that the EPA moves to declare the Front Range a severe air quality violator. And the basis for that was on these number of days on this purple graph that we failed to stay below the ozone limits, and the dark purple depicts the number of days that we didn't stay below the less stringent requirements of 75, and then the light purple 70. So if we get the severe classification, many more companies in Colorado will be forced to obtain and comply with tougher state air pollution permits. And this has implications for gas stations and the price of gas. A lot of things bleed into the price of gas, but they'll be required to sell cleaner burning fuel during the summer ozone season. And so that has equity implications for patients because of rising costs. So knowing this, what are ways that we can protect patients from high ozone concentrations? So you guys are probably familiar with air trackers. So there's Air Now and weatherbug.com for people who are plugged in to a smart device. And for people who aren't plugged into a smart device, that's even more reason why these social networks are important, not only for heat illness, but also for keeping safe or protecting yourself from poor air quality, so that people can go and check on them and remind them about these safety measures. So on days that have high ground level ozone, think about spending more time indoors where ozone levels are usually lower, distant from those photochemical reactions that are happening. And then choose easier outdoor activities so you don't breathe as hard. And then if you do outdoor activities, plan them at times when the ozone levels are usually lower. And then there are a number of policy implications that we won't go into here. So shifting over to PM, so particulate matter, it's another major air pollutant, and it's a broad term that referring to multiple different substances with multiple components that can be acids, organic chemicals, metals, and we classify them according to size. So on this, in this diagram, is a human hair, and then relative to that, PM10 are these smaller particles that can be seen usually by the naked eye, so mold, dust, and then PM2.5 are those smaller particles that we can't see that go deep into the lungs and cause similar reactions to ozone because of how far they go into the bronchioles. But because of the number of different chemicals, you can't really say what exactly all of them are, well, all of them do here, but just know that they come from forest fires, dust for the PM10, but then electricity generating power plants, and then things that are, happen near highways, near traffic, and industry, heavy industry. And so that's where primary PM2.5 comes, and the secondary refers to when the PM2.5 is made by chemical reactions after they're released. So a lot of research has also been done on the disease-specific mortality of PM2.5. And so this graphic comes from the Lancet study of data from, again, the 2015 Global Burden of Disease, and it looks at disease-specific mortality that's attributable to PM2.5 starting in 1990 and going up to 2015. And the biggest portion, the pink portion, is ischemic heart disease, with the total deaths from this growing throughout the years. And other causes of death that are attributed to PM2.5 are respiratory cancers, cerebrovascular disease in gray, COPD, and pneumonias. And so from the same study, 4 million of the deaths that occurred worldwide can be attributed to PM2.5, and 88,000 in the US, which is equivalent to 18 per 100,000 deaths. So where does Denver Aurora stand in the rankings for PM2.5? So it did a little better. It didn't make the top 25, but it is still pretty up there at 33. And then on the flip side, there are some cleaner cities. So this is from the list of cleanest cities, the top 25 cleanest cities. 3 Colorado cities made that. So those are good places to go to if you're looking for cleaner air, I guess. So recalling the major sources of PM2.5, wildfire smoke is one of the major ones, and this is going to be on our minds really soon when it comes to what we are now calling wildfire season. So if you ever wonder why the smoke feels so bad in the lungs, this is a partial list of the things that are floating around in it. So the PM2.5 is what gives it that scatters the light and gives the haze that we see, and there are a number of other toxics listed here. I recently learned that the farther away you are from the smoke, the more chemical reactions have occurred, and the more dangerous it is considered. And it's interesting to me because, and important because people who are really far away, in Connecticut and New York, are experiencing the health effects of the smoke that is coming from our state and other states in our area. So the list of or the considerations in how to protect patients from PM2.5 is similar to that we saw in ozone. These trackers track both ozone and PM2.5 and have, there are days where ozone is high and PM2.5 isn't. But when it is high at the ground level, similar recommendations, but also just avoid proximity to sources of PM2.5. So avoid those busy roads and highways where it's usually worse. And so this is really interesting to me, allergies and health. So many of us and many of our patients, including Mrs. M, are afflicted by allergies. I recently talked to a patient in the ER 2 weeks ago who told me she was there for flu, but she told me that she thought her allergies were getting worse. And she told me, is it from climate change? And so of course I got all excited and I told her about all the reasons why allergies there is an association between climate change and worsening allergies. And it's been linked, the reason for that. So it's been linked with earlier pollination in areas with more frost-free days, and therefore increased exposure to allergens. And this means more symptoms for those who have allergies, but it also means there's more exposure. And so people who don't have allergies have that exposure, and so they're more likely to develop allergies. And there have been some really fascinating studies done, especially by Dr. Lou Ziska, who used to work at the USDA or at the FDA. And he looked at the influence of different climate factors like temperature and CO2 concentrations on the allergenicity of plants. So he found that plants, especially ragweed, and he studied a couple other varieties, but I can't remember which they were right now, but ragweed will grow bigger. And also the protein content of the allergen content is more concentrated in higher CO2 concentrations, concentration growing environments, kind of simulating what we're seeing with climate change. And then wanted to mention mold as well. So there's increased mold exposure in areas that are susceptible to severe weather like hurricanes. And I should also mention that in areas that are susceptible to drought, like Colorado, if there's less rainfall, the rain takes allergens out of the air. So there's also more exposure for that reason. I put this study here for your reference. So Dr. Crooks works at National Jewish and also at the School of Public Health. And he did this study looking over 6 years, I think, or 9 years of pollen concentrations of a number of different allergenic species, trees, grasses, and something else. And trees, grass, and weeds, and also the temperature trends. And he found these, he got these summary findings that there were earlier season starts and longer seasons of certain allergenic species. And the mean daily temperature was positively associated with pollen concentrations for grass, trees, but not with weeds. And so it's a really cool design, cool study to look at if you get a chance. You know, the correlation of the longer season and the earlier start or later end didn't occur in all species, but it was there in some. And this is important, you know, if you know what species your patients are allergic to, it can be important to be able to follow these trends. So in patients with allergies, there are also allergen forecasters, or pollen forecasters, and this is one through the quadruple AI, the Allergy and Immunology Society. And then, you know, for people who are benefited by Claritin, make sure that they have that and they're taking it early. And then for people with severe allergies, consider referral to an allergist. Which is something we have to remind ourselves at Denver Health because we don't have them easily available. So considerations overall in how to prevent morbidity and mortality related to poor air quality. So education is really the first thing. And so HEPA filters are things that you can purchase or things that you can make, you know, if the purchasing them is too expensive. This is my neighbor who was outside during COVID and also during a wildfire season wearing 2 masks because mainly because of her allergies, just so that she could breathe. Make sure that you're wearing a mask outside, non-medical N95, because that's really the only one that will prevent contact with PM 2.5. And then reduce exposure to indoor pollutants like incense, wood burning stoves, and fireplaces on those higher concentration days. Talked about these things. And then remember that heat exacerbates poor air quality because of, especially in people who have those predisposing conditions, that do all of your anticipatory guidance and counseling against tobacco is another exposure worth minimizing. All right, and then I wanted to mention a little bit extreme weather and disaster preparedness. You know, this doesn't really hit the Front Range that often, but I guess that's why they're disasters. You don't really expect them. And the thing that came in mind to me were power outages, which we've seen on massive scales in places like Texas and places where there are hurricanes like New York, New Jersey, New Orleans. So you get these major disasters and power outages, and people who are reliant on oxygen or refrigerated medications, or you lose access to transportation and can't get the needed medical care, suffer and people die. So this does not happen yet on a massive scale in Colorado, but I have been noticing a lot more power outages, and they're very short-lived in my experience. But in a new community north of Denver, there was this prolonged power outage last summer where there was a week where people didn't have access to power. And you know, it happens. I think there's going to be more demand for energy, more demand for electricity, and you're going to have these moving shortages. And so it's just something to keep in mind that people who do rely on oxygen maybe should have a backup tank in the case of power outages, more frequent power outages. That's all I wanted to say about that. So I really like these pyramids. So I kind of filled this in for ways that we can help our patients adapt to climate-related hazards. So we talked about a specific number that are facing the Front Range, so increased temperatures and air pollution. And we talked about some tips on how to protect patients from the health effects associated with these hazards. So at the personal level, things that we can do are, you know, understanding these climate-related hazards and how they affect our patients. And then on the patient level, we can educate them about these risks, educate their caregivers. We can encourage them to vote. We can manage their chronic medical conditions so that they have more resilience to face, you know, poor air quality and heat. And then a number of other things that I've listed here and won't go over in detail on the local, regional, and greater policy change side of things. And adaptation really fits more into our job description. But mitigation is also something that I think is important. So, you know, every day we're experts at managing diabetes and hypertension, but what if we had a way to prevent obesity and avoid a number of downstream complications? And I think climate change mitigation is kind of along those same lines. So we have another patient here. So babies born this year will probably be alive by the end of the century, and they're going to have a geriatric visit in 2100. What is this going to look like? So I really like this graphic. I wanted to share. This is something that was developed by Dr. Chris Karnauskas up at CU Boulder, and this graph represents CO2 concentrations over a longer period of time than we saw earlier. So going back to 800,000 years before present. And so we've been bumping along between 200 and less than 300 parts per million CO2. We said how it measured 280 in pre-industrial times. And then over the course of a little more than 100 years, we've reached record high concentrations that's corresponding with this 1 degree warmer compared with the early 1800s. And then we can apply different climate models to make projections about end of century CO2 concentrations. And so starting with this most conservative model, you know, assuming another revolution in carbon sink technologies and reductions in emissions, we might be able to hold back at 420 parts per million by 2100, but following more realistic pathways, we might reach between 540 and 625. But if we go on as business as usual, we can get up to this most extreme condition where we can see up to 6 degrees warmer at the equator, that's Celsius, or 1.5 degrees warmer in the US. And so the lines represent different projections, but the course that we take really depends on the decisions that we make today. And health systems, which is where we are, really contribute a lot to this problem. And this is a study that was done by Jody Sherman and Matt Eckelman in 2018, and it really influenced the way I thought about climate change and health and got me a lot more interested in the subject. And it showed that the healthcare system as an industry contributes 10% of US greenhouse gas emissions. And there's this other statistic that's kind of resonates with me, that if the US healthcare system was considered its own country, it would rank 7th in the world for greenhouse gas emissions. And that comes from the Commonwealth Fund in 2018. In later papers that were done by Jody Sherman and Matt Eckelman, they estimated that healthcare sector related emissions cause 405 to 470,000 DALYs. So that's on the same scale as the Institute of Medicine's report that estimated 44 to 98,000 annual deaths occur from preventable medical errors. So when you put it in the context of people and lives, I think it really is kind of humbling and makes you think about what can be done. And what can be done, or what can be done has to start. What can be done is a lot of different things. And I didn't put a slide in here on this, but I should have, because the university just joined Practice Green Health. Denver Health is a member of Practice Green Health. And Practice Green Health offers a number of different benchmarks, tracks a number of different benchmarks for how to monitor emissions from healthcare operations. And by monitoring those benchmarks and making improvements, can really contribute to cutting down on this system-wide, on this 10%. But the pace of change really depends on how quickly we act. And the earlier we act, the slower the pace can be, and the more organized this can be. So, 3.3% 10 years before this report came out is how much reductions would have to be taken. And then if we wait to 2025, then the percentage is going to be much greater. So here's the pyramid again, drawn from mitigation. So from counseling and education at the top to policy change at the bottom. And I've listed some thoughts on how we can help promote climate change mitigation, which is, again, less in our job description, but something worth considering, especially given the potential consequences for health along the business as usual trajectories. And even the small changes can just put us in the mindset that bigger changes are possible. So with that in mind, in summary, climate change threatens health, independence, and quality of life for older people. But geriatricians and all physicians can play important roles in protecting current and future patients from the health impacts of climate change. And I'll leave you with a quote from one of my favorite poets, that every day we're learning not to live with essence, how to live with essence, not ease, how to move with haste, not hate, and how to leave this pain that is beyond us behind us. Just like any skill or part, we cannot possess hope without practicing it. It is the most fundamental craft we demand of ourselves. And with that, I thank you for your interest in this topic and your attention, and I'll open it up to any questions people might have. And my email address is missing an H. Feel free to contact me.
Thank you, Dr. Gillespie, so much. That was a wonderful Grand Rounds presentation. I would invite anyone to add questions to the chat for Dr. Gillespie. Okay, we've got a pretty small group today. So I don't know if we have any questions, Dr. Gillespie, from our audience, but thank you so much for joining us and for that wonderful Grand Rounds presentation. Oh, yep. Oh, we have just a comment. Okay, from Dr. Orris. Excellent presentation and very sobering. I think the changes that we're seeing and that we're going to see are going to be exceedingly impactful on our older adult population. And, you know, as we approach, I think, the midpoint of this century, it looks like things are going to be very, very different. And so it'll be a lot of new environmental factors or things that are already in play, you know, more important for our patients. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. To be in touch. And yeah, I think those impacts are we're already seeing them. And I think just being able to help people adapt to them is really important, and being more attentive to the environmental risk factors that our patients have is something that that we're trying to teach the medical students now to do. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be done. And yeah, thank you so much.
Most relevant topic. Thank you so much. Take care. Okay. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.